Hey, everybody. Welcome to another film from Livable Planet. So excited to have you here. We're lucky enough to have in conversation Leo Plunkett, director of Our Mother's Land. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe a good place to start is, how did you kind of hear about the goings on in this community and decide that this was a film that you wanted to capture?
We work in a project, Gecko project, and we've been working out in Indonesia for nearly a decade now. The team has. So we were very invested in the sort of stories out there, and we're always kind of finding new journalists to work with us in Indonesia. And someone who attracted our attention quite a lot was Fabriana Ferdelis. And she reports predominantly on Papua, so we were interested in her working on that side of Indonesia for us, and bringing her into the fold. Sort of, she had this idea to go on this journey around Indonesia and talk to some of these female activists that she had reported on before over the years, because they're all kind of historic cases that happened like at different times in Indonesia's past. So yeah, she came to us with this idea initially as stories. So we were going to put them into each case. We were going to make a story out of it. And Tom, who's the head of the Gecko project, approached me and asked me if I wanted to follow her on this journey, reporting on these stories and make a film about it alongside the stories. So yeah, that's kind of how it came about. And Fabiana really led on the stories because she knows them, like she was very experienced with these, like they're all kind of her friends really, these women. So we just that was kind of how it evolved. We just followed her doing her thing, reporting.
Well, and how do you, it's a really kind of fascinating film, and love the people that you guys were able to connect with. Given kind of the involvement with the Gecko project, like how have you seen like the kind of use of digital tools and filmmaking to kind of like amplify the voice of different people and communities, and also just the kind of missions of organizations? I mean, typically it's like, if you see a nonprofit, it's like a video for funders, whereas this kind of, is a real film, and allows kind of a viewer to kind of immerse themselves in it. But yeah, how have you found that kind of digital tools like, filmmaking have kind of changed the way that activists are able to kind of get their message out there and make change in the world?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time, and I think it's kind of only in recent years, like probably the last 5 years, that filmmaking has become so accessible. It's kind of democratized this idea that only people with equipment can make films. Only people with certain levels of experience, people who've gone to film school, whatever. I think now it's just like an open playing field, and this is really exciting for kind of organizations who like grassroots organizations, specifically in places like Indonesia, because they can, you can be in a remote village like in the middle of Sulawesi, like no contact really with any big institutions or anything, and you can make an amazing film because you can go and your phone shoots like better video than DV cams did like 10 years ago. So it's like a mad revolution really, and I think that sort of front line is a really interesting place to experience it, and it's something we're really kind of pushing as well. Like we really want to get a lot, because there's a lot of places in Indonesia very hard to access, specifically Papua. A lot of East Indonesia is really, really hard for someone like me to go out and film in. So if you can get sort of the communities and the people on the front lines filming stuff, they'll get stuff like live action, like they'll get as these stories unfold, they'll be there filming them. So yeah, I mean it's an exciting time, I think, for filmmaking. And yeah, I mean obviously as a filmmaker, as a shooter, I can go on my own. Like it was a two-person crew. It was on the ground. It was me and Fabriana. So she was the reporter. I was doing everything else. I mean, you just wouldn't be able to do that kind of 10 years ago, really. Um, so yeah, I mean, all these things make it very exciting, I think.
Cool. And one of the questions that often comes up, in the making of documentary is like, what's the kind of participants' involvement in the film, in the sense of like, were they kind of creative collaborators with this, or did you kind of take a more observational approach? And when they knew that you wanted to kind of tell these stories, I mean, was there any sort of reticence at all? I mean, in the sense of like that there could be blowback if these stories were shared, or how did you encourage them to decide to participate?
Yeah, well, I think our advantage from the offset was having Fabriana because she had a very close relationship with the participant. Well, some of them. I mean, some of them she was discovering, but certainly the first scene in the film is about the Kendeng farmers in Java. And Fabriana's been reporting on that story for nearly a decade. So she knew them really well. But we always made sure that line was there where we were, yeah, it was very much an observation because we didn't want uh, kind of cross contamination of the story. We wanted it to be very much um, Fabiana learning a different side of the story. So um, yeah, definitely that was kind of how we developed these characters because it was kind of yeah Fabriana exploring it herself. So we just kind of sat back and observed, and that was quite a nice position to be in. We weren't forcing anything. We knew that it wasn't kind of like badgering people to do certain things. It was kind of what came of it came of it, and I think yeah, I mean, it made the editing tricky because you're then kind of trying to create a narrative out of this long meandering um, sort of interviews and discussions. I mean, yeah, to call them interviews is they weren't really. They were more like discussions. So yeah,
Mm.
obviously, it's kind of made it more difficult in that respect, but I think it also made it much more natural in the end product and much more genuine for the people in the film. I think because we every one of them has screened it in their own villages and they've all watched it together and they kind of like the feedback we've got is they're really kind of chuffed with how they came across. And I think that's probably because it was just them sitting down talking about their experiences rather than being told to do certain things. And yeah.
Very much so. I can imagine. I mean, so for those of us that aren't so familiar with Indonesia, like what do you think some of the kind of biggest challenges that these communities are that they're dealing with, and like what's the kind of hoped for outcome, that you feel that you and your team are kind of working towards?
Yeah, I mean, Indonesia's a very complex place because it's this enormous island nation. So, and with with cultures spanning from kind of like in East Indonesia, it's like you wouldn't recognize the people between East Indonesia and Java. You just wouldn't think they were from the same country. I mean, it's like that diverse. Um, and then you've got this sort of central government powerhouse in Java that is trying to rule over these islands, and it just doesn't often match up. Like you've got this real like disconnect between a lot of the different places, and I think that creates a lot of friction, um, and it creates this sort of almost neo-colonialism within like the sort of elite in Java compared to the sort of communities out in the far reaches of these islands, but not even, like Borneo Island, for instance, is just really underpopulated. It's very like it's kind of communities living quite traditional lives in a lot of
Mm.
ways, and they're being forced into this modern way of living. And you've got like huge industries like the palm oil sector and oil and gas and coal because it's such a resource rich country. So you've got all this pressure on these communities and their land, and all their land is very much like community owned, and these
Mm.
companies come in and manipulate that community ownership to get what they want out of it, and these communities then get cast aside. And so I think it's kind of this constant battle between I reserve to say indigenous communities because there's not always indigenous communities, but there is a lot of like indigenous communities there who are constantly battling against this sort of almost neocolonialism. So
Mm.
yeah, that's something we experience a lot in Indonesia, I think, which is quite unique, really.
And I mean, what's the kind of in kind of working on the ground as like a filmmaker, or journalist, or even with an NGO? I mean, is I mean, are you guys are there different kind of threats or danger that you guys are dealing with, or is it one of those things that it's kind of accepted that you're just kind of telling and reporting from the front lines there?
It's becoming increasingly difficult to report there, especially as a foreign journalist. Um, it's really becoming uh, like really even in recent years, it's become harder and harder to work out there as even like the scientific researcher. I mean, it's and
Hmm.
especially as a journalist. It always depends where you are in the country. The further east you go, the more difficult it gets for sure. And it depends how close you are to big corporate interests like mining areas and big palm oil areas. Like recently, they're getting really sensitive about the fires that happen every year. They're burning like the sort of land burning they do for the palm oil industry and these sort of things. Like so, yeah, you've got to really be aware of those things. Like if you're heading directly into a story that you know is going to be kind of fictitious for them, like you've got to be very careful about how you approach it. And so, for instance, like Papua, we just don't go. Like we get local um, filmmakers to get footage out in Papua for us. We
Hmm.
don't even bother trying to risk it because we know we could potentially get arrested, deported, whatever. So yeah, I mean, obviously, it's just about knowing the risks and keeping them in mind whenever you do a trip like this.
Well, yeah, it's a really powerful and inspiring film, and I guess just in the way that you construct it, you kind of alluded to some of the challenges in the editing process. Is like, did you know when you first started kind of crafting these stories that you'd have like this hour-long film, or how did this kind of film wind up in the end of like what was the kind of original vision, and like how did the kind of film evolve over the course of making it, or where
Yeah,
did you find
so
its voice?
yeah, I mean, we definitely knew we wanted to make a longer film because we kind of make quite a lot of like short films, and I think we wanted to make something really substantial in this. I don't think we expected it to be an hour, that's for sure, but these things happen. Um, but our main motivation for the narrative was the journey and Fabiana Fidelis exploring the characters. So we kind of had that groundwork. Like we knew what the structure was going to be. We knew we were going to these certain places, and then we were going to structure the edit around this journey. The challenge was each like linking the sections was definitely a massive challenge because we didn't want these to be isolated stories and you're going from one to the next. It was like we wanted this to say something bigger than that. We wanted it to be a kind of a film that had an overall message and kind of feel to it. So we've got these really contrasting locations and very contrasting characters, but we had to sort of bring it together into something that was an overall narrative. So that was a massive challenge. I think the other challenge was each of these individual cases, like incredibly complex and sometimes spanned over decades. Um, and we weren't really making it about the cases. It was more about the women and their experiences fighting like these cases. So we had to create the context of the case and then do the discussions around how it affected their lives. So yeah, it was a constant balancing act. Like some of the sections, it took a very long time to refine it into something that was well balanced. But yeah,
And that does raise a question I had for you. And I don't. It's been a little while since I'd seen the film, but like, what what's the kind of general role of like kind of role of women in Indonesian society? You know, in the sense that like, um, is this something that you know is surprising, or are they kind of the kind of ethical gatekeepers of their communities? Like, what's the kind of role of women, or what's the role that gender plays in Indonesian society?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I can really be an authority on this, but from my experience shooting the film, it's really interesting. Like Indonesia's constantly juxtaposing that we've got this um, really metropolitan, very progressive parts of it, and then you've got the very traditional community side of it, and then you've got these like really furious, like fighting women who are kind of leading all this activism. So you can't really put any one thing on what the women's role out there is. It's kind of yeah. I mean, you can pick another society and say, oh well, the women's role is kind of this and that, but in Indonesia, it's kind of all these things combined, and then the massive extremes of it as well, because obviously a lot of it's like the biggest Muslim majority country in the world. Like you've got a lot of sort of very conservative Islamic ideas of what a woman should be, and then you've got all these varying different cultures, like indigenous communities who've got very, very different ideas of what women should be, and then you've got this sort of metropolitan, very Western idea of what women should be. So yeah, it's all these things coming together. But I think what's always really strong is this kind of you've got to fight for your community like that. And I think yeah, that's kind of unfaltering in all these women. Like that was what we always came across. They just no questions asked. They were fighting because they had to.
Neat. And as we kind of wrap things up, do you have another kind of project and will that you're kind of working on, and will that be in Indonesia as well, or anything you can tell us about the next thing you'd like to dive into?
Yeah, I mean, we've got many, many ideas, but obviously, when we'll be able to go out and do them is anyone's guess at the moment. Who knows when we'll be able to next travel out there? But yeah, we've got some really interesting stuff coming up. Because the Gecko project is like a reporting initiative, so there's a lot of written stuff that's coming up, which will have sort of video stuff accompanying it, and yeah, lots of sort of really talented reporters on the ground doing some stuff as well. So yeah, there'll be a lot of bits coming out, but when the next feature film comes out, who knows? that'll be anyone's guess.
And what is our best way to kind of follow the Kego Project's efforts, and like what can we do in the audience to kind of help support what you all do?
Yeah, well, you can visit we've got a website for both the Indonesian and international site. So it's geckoproject.org and thegeckoproject.id. And then yeah, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and all of those things. Yeah.
Well, very cool. Well, thanks again for making a really lovely film, Leo, and also sharing it with us at Livable Planet. And of course, have a great day.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm really glad it's part of the festival.
Yeah, thank you.